Hello and welcome to yet another commentary from King's Comments. It's been a while since my last audio message, but we've got a lot to go through. This particular audio message will be shorter than usual, and it's primarily because it's more of the same. There have been some new developments, and we'll be discussing some of the new geopolitical narratives that are starting to form as a direct result of what's happening on the battlefield and politically around the world. So let's just get into it real quickly. Along the Eastern Front, the Russian advance has been measured. They're consistently taking villages, cities, territory. That hasn't been the main focal point of the Russian advance. The Russian advance has been primarily designed to decimate Western armor, Western equipment, Western munition systems, and to degrade the Ukrainian military further in terms of its manpower. But in an area called the Touretsk region, the Russians have made massive gains, taking huge swaths of land, taking villages, and taking Touretsk itself, and to the point where the Ukrainians are trying to rush military manpower to that area in an already stretched situation. Now, the Ukrainians have done a general mobilization where they mobilized about 130,000 men. But it must be said, according to General Syrskyi, who's the head of the Ukrainian High Command, that those particular men are not of the caliber of the ones that they had in 2022 because they're not patriots. And he sensed along the front that there was a general lack of motivation. And to be honest with you, why would these people be motivated? They've been conscripted. These are not people that volunteered. Likely many of them were kidnapped and were forced into joining the military, and they've only had 3-4 days worth of training, and they're being used as cannon fodder against the game changer that's being used on the battlefield to great effect, which has been the Russian Fab bombs. Fab 500s, Fab 1500s, Fab 2000s, and Fab 3000s have been used to devastating effect along the eastern part of the front in the Avdiivka, Donetsk, Touretsk area. Just devastating effect. And what these bombs do is they basically eliminate buildings, defensive fortifications, and they create what amounts to the conventional mushroom plume that we're accustomed to seeing with nuclear type bombs of the tactical nature. So what we're seeing right now in this area is a complete destruction, decimation of the Ukrainian military by the Russian armed forces and the Russian aviation forces by using these bombs to eliminate what amounts to good fortifications in these areas and eliminate huge amounts of military personnel without the Russians having to fire a shot. Now, the other thing that hasn't really gotten a lot of airplay is that these Fab bombs have been used not only to eliminate fortifications, but they've also been used to eliminate Ukrainian supply depots, Ukrainian ammunition depots, and Ukrainian deployment centers. And this is significant because many of the recruits that are being redeployed into certain areas for combat have to meet at a meeting point, and many of those meetings, because it's large amounts of people, are in buildings, large buildings, and these buildings are now being bombed to the point where these buildings cease to exist, and the people in them also cease to exist. So it's creating major, major problems for their ability to redeploy and for their ability to resupply. And I think everybody knows that every army's issue when it comes to war and the ability to facilitate war comes down to those two words: resupply, redeploy. Redeploy is important because you have to be able to reconstitute brigades, units that have been decimated. You have to be able to resupply these individuals because they need food, water, ammunition, etc. These are all areas of concern because these are being systematically destroyed, and that includes the railways, trains. The Russian aviation forces have been pounding Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian railways, Ukrainian energy facilities. Anything that supports the war effort, they've been pounding. And this is along the Eastern Front as well as in the Kharkiv region. I talked about the Kharkiv region to the north being a diversion, and it's been a tremendous boon for the Russian military. They had never intended to take Kharkiv. There's a lot of talk in the West about, the Russians were going to take the city of Kharkiv. That is absolute nonsense. This was always a feint. They only had about 6,000 to 10,000 men in this area. Their entire strategic objective was to create what amounts to a buffer zone or corridor where they could inflict damage and pull Ukrainian troops from the east to this area because of the fear factor of Kharkiv being so close to Volchansk, for example. And it worked. The Ukrainians fell for the bait. The West fell for the bait. Almost 30,000 Ukrainians have been caught in this cauldron. And because of the fact that the Russians have eliminated the bridges, have eliminated any hope of resupply in the northern part of Volchansk, as well as Lipsy, particularly Volchansk, it's become a kill box for the Ukrainians because of the fact that you would think with 30,000 men against 6,000 to 10,000 men, they would be able to push the Russians back, but they simply do not have the firepower. And I want to get into this firepower issue with a little bit more information. The thing about the Volchansk area that we're seeing to devastating effect is that the Ukrainians, every time they mount a counteroffensive in the area, it's basically what amounts to meat assaults with limited amounts of personnel carriers that have been able to get through the highway of death. The Russians have basically pushed everything into one kill box or one highway for resupply, and it's created an opportunity for Russian FPV drone operators to eliminate personnel carriers, tanks, howitzers, MLR systems to great effect. And this is terrible because it leaves the Ukrainian army with virtually nothing other than its FPV drone operators as a form of support to be able to deal with the massive firepower that they're getting hit with in this area. So small amounts of Russian forces have taken over the aggregate plant to the south of the northern part of Volchansk. And at the same time, Russian munition systems, the TOS munition system, which is what I like to call the Russian equivalent of the Katyusha rocket, except it's just that much more lethal. This particular thing has been used to great effect, hitting and pounding positions that the Ukrainians are holding, and likely causing massive casualties at the same time. And anytime the Ukrainians assault without armor, they're just getting killed rather quickly. So 30,000 men are being ground down against 6,000 Russian soldiers. And these 30,000 men are men that were cobbled together from various divisions along the Eastern Front, were moved from Chasiv Yar, moved from Kupiansk, moved from Ocheretino, moved from Kherson region, and this is just a horrible situation because manpower is a serious issue. Now, I want to get to Russian losses because I had a comment recently that someone said, well, Russians are suffering losses as well. Well, yes, war is a nasty business. Let me be clear about this. People die in war from both sides. The Russians have lost significant men in material. But the issue is that their losses are replaceable. And I use that word replaceable because of the fact that it has not impacted their conscription efforts. The amount of volunteers are 30 to 40,000 new volunteers per month because they see this as their second great patriotic war. The Russian arms industry has grown demonstrably. They can replace their tanks as quickly as they lose them. They can replace all of their assets as quickly as they can, as quickly as they're lost on the battlefield. And when you consider the fact that Zelensky is still talking about the slow pace of U.S. aid, it would appear that while the Ukrainians are getting this aid as quickly as they get it, in terms of HIMARS, Patriots, Bradleys, the things you need in terms of armor, they're being destroyed as quickly as they get it. Just recently, 2 more Patriot systems were eliminated. A HIMARS system was eliminated. And these are systems that are extremely expensive and hard to find and hard to replace. The issue for Ukraine is that it cannot continue to keep fighting this war, losing the amount of men that it's losing, and expect that when the armor does arrive, they'll have enough people to handle that armor. So this is a war that's going to be coming, and in my opinion, to an end here very quickly. And if it doesn't come to an end on the battlefield, my expectation is that it's likely to come to an end when new governments in Europe and in the United States replace the neocons that have decided to sacrifice the Ukrainian public for their own political means. So when you start looking at this from the context of what's happening on the battlefield conditions are driving much of the success that Russia is having with its economy, with a lot of different things. And at the same time, it's creating real problems in the European Union and NATO. And you're starting to see this mutiny happening in the European Union and NATO as different political parties and the establishment vie for power. And as the establishment begins to see other voices taking shape and starting to form governments. So one geopolitical narrative and fallout from this war right now is what's happening in France. The far left and the far right, who don't see eye to eye on just about anything, do see eye to eye when it comes to France's escalation in this Ukraine conflict. And Macron's center-right party has been devastated in the European parliamentary election and has been devastated in their own snap elections that he called, with the far-right party gaining about 33 to 34% of the vote. There is an upcoming second round of ballots to be cast in terms of who will be the leader of the parliament in the lower house. But it's pretty clear that Macron is wounded and doesn't have and won't have the same ability to be able to direct foreign policy with the vigor that he once did, because of the fact that a large segment of the French population is against it. We're also seeing in Germany muted voices coming out of Germany, because the German economy has basically been deindustrialized by the Greens and the far left. They're clinging on to their LNG imports from Russia, because without it, the German economy is dead, and Olaf Scholz knows it. His opinion poll ratings are lower than 15%. So when an election is called in Germany, he will no longer be the leader in 2025. That's pretty clear. In the United States, after the disastrous debate from Joe Biden, the president, and his glassy-eyed sort of Parkinson look, it's pretty clear that if he continues to stay on as the leader against what many in the Democratic Party believe is a nightmare scenario, Trump will win by a landslide, and this will spell the end of the neocon running the White House for at least the next 4 years and running what amounts to this Ukraine war from the Oval Office. So the key here moving forward is that the Russians are driving this whole thing. I mean, I find it interesting that the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, who's now chairperson for the EU in a rotating presidency, made a decision to go to both Ukraine and Russia to seek some sort of peace resolution. But at the same time, he's being called a traitor by the EU, even though he wasn't there on official EU business. The optics for the EU doesn't look good. The optics for NATO doesn't look good. Their whole thing was to create a strategic defeat, or at least put one on Russia, and it's failed miserably. There's no good end for them other than their losses in elections or their losses on the battlefield. And I sense moving forward that the situation is going to get progressively worse on the battlefield, and it's going to get progressively worse at their own meetings as the dissension starts to become more and more apparent moving forward. So again, much to do about nothing. It isn't nothing on the battlefield. People are dying every day. The only issue is the fact that this war could be stopped. I don't see any reason for Ukraine to continue this. It makes no sense to fight on when there's no hope of being able, from a manpower perspective, to retake the 4 territories in Crimea. Those hopes have been dashed. Those dreams have been dashed. That will not happen. And if anything, Ukraine may cease to exist if they continue on this path to destruction. It's really up to the Ukrainian people. I think that part of the reason why the Ukrainian people, for large measure, have not stood up outside of the people that have endeavored to flee the country, is primarily because of the fact that a large segment of the population have not been affected by this war, because when you look at the nightclubs, when you look at the cafes in Kiev, it almost seems like things are pretty much normal. They're not impacted by this war. Many of the Western Ukrainians, people that aren't culturally the same as Eastern Ukrainians, have not been drafted. These were the original volunteers. They've all been killed off. And so what's left are people that don't want to be drafted, people that aren't motivated. And even if you have 200,000 unmotivated soldiers, it really isn't going to make a difference. You'd rather have 20,000 motivated fighters than 200,000 unmotivated men who are likely to die quickly because they don't have the training, or who will surrender or run in the face of what's coming their way. I mentioned earlier that these fab bombs have devastated the Ukrainian morale, devastated Ukrainian attempts at resupply, devastated just about everything you can think of. And clearly the fab bombs have been a game changer on the battlefield. One area where these bombs have been used to great effect has been in the Chasiv Yar area. This was an area that the Ukrainians had said that they were going to hold to the last man. They were going to hold because it's high ground. And losing this area would basically mean losing the Donbass. And clearly, over the last few days, what we've seen is the Russians, after hard, heavy fighting, building to building, hand to hand, have taken the eastern part of Chasiv Yar up to the canal or aqueduct. This is where all the high rises are. This is where all of the major buildings were. This is where the majority of the heavy fighting was taking place. They've taken it, and they're basically involved in mopping up campaigns right now in that area. The western part of Chasiv Yar is more of what I like to call the less urban area, more homes, more single-family dwellings, less large-scale towers and buildings, more fortifications on the ground. But these fortifications can be clearly seen, and I would imagine here very shortly that Russian fab bombs will be used to massive effect prior to any storming of western Chasiv Yar. And once Chasiv Yar is taken, then pretty much the whole Donbass is gone. Much of the surrounding areas around Chasiv Yar have already been taken. All of the supply lines have been cut. The roads, the highways, all of them are in Russian hands for the most part. And it's just becoming untenable as we move forward. So again, on the ground, it's more of the same, more measured advances by the Russians, taking territory, eliminating and decimating supply lines, deployment centers, bombing their abilities to redeploy, bombing their energy facilities, just creating massive psychological effect as well as real effect on the battlefield. And this is continuing at the expense of Ukrainians that were mobilized against their best judgment. So this is my audio message for today. And I'll be looking to put out a new audio message shortly. But I want to thank everyone for sharing, liking, and subscribing to this channel. And we'll have many more changes coming here soon.